Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Azarat. I'm the director of the Simon Center for Principles in Politics and the AWC Family Foundation here at the Heritage Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture on Antifa. The left, as you well know, has long been enamored with political violence. If you look at the three greatest leftist revolutions of all time, they were all soaked in blood. The French, the Russian, and then the one that outdid them all, Mao's Cultural Revolution. Here in America, I think we remember that the 1960s were not all peace and love sit-ins and music festivals. We also had to deal with the Weather Underground, radical elements of the SDS, the Black Panthers, and later the Symbionese Liberation Army, who killed and bombed in the name of overthrowing the imperialist American regime. Meanwhile, they were given cover by prominent leftist intellectuals who justified the bloodshed. Herbert Marcuse, aka the father of the New Left, drew a distinction which one finds to this day on the left between the violence of the oppressors and the violence of the oppressed. The oppressed, he thought, had no choice but to resort to violence to resist the tyranny of the American regime. Today, a far-left revolutionary movement calling itself Antifa has organized mass violence in the streets of American cities. Infamous for dressing head to toe in black, Antifa militants organized to destroy property, beat up people, and intimidate their opposition into silence, all of course in the name of opposing fascism. And despite their well-documented track record of violence, they still find support on the left, and their leaders continue to skirt justice. Now, details on the size and structure of the organization are difficult to discern. But much of what we know about them, we know thanks to the intrepid reporting of Andy Ngo. Andy has been covering Antifa since they burst onto the national scene in 2017. He is the editor-at-large of the Post-Millennial and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and the New York Post. He was formerly on the editorial team of Quillette magazine. In June, Andy was assaulted and robbed by a violent Antifa mob during a protest in Portland, Oregon. He was hospitalized with a traumatic brain injury following the incident. Police, alas, have made no arrests in connection with the beating, even though at least one of the assailants was caught on camera without a mask. Please join me in welcoming Andy Ngo.
How do I activate the, okay. Hi, everyone. Well, first, thanks so much for being here. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Heritage Foundation for inviting me and giving me the chance to speak with you all. My name is Andy Ngo. But before I begin talking about Antifa, which is why you're all here, I'm going to tell you about the lives of two people that you've never heard of, but it's relevant to the story. Okay. On the left is a photo of a young woman named Thuy Mai, and on the right, the man is Wook Bin. Thuy Mai came from a middle-class, nouveau-riche family on the southeastern coast of the former South Vietnam. Her parents were entrepreneurs. They had started and grew a successful jewelry business. Thuy Mai, however, had no interest in learning the trade of the family business. She excelled in academic studies. She loved history, literature, and music in particular. And she was one of the few girls to learn how to play the mandolin. She wanted to be part of the first generation of women to go to university in her country. Wook Bin, on the other side, was born into a poor family. His mother was a widow, and he never knew his father, who died when he was a young child. He was educated to only around 15 years old because he had to start working to help support his family. As a young adult, he became an entry-level police officer in a small town also on the southeastern coast of South Vietnam. Both their lives were turned completely upside down after the fall of Saigon in 1975, which reunited North and South Vietnam into one communist state. The Workers' Revolution won. Both Duy Mai and Wook Bin were sent to prison camps, but for entirely different reasons. For Duy Mai, it was because her family were deemed bourgeois. As punishment for allegedly profiting off the back of Vietnamese workers, their home and business were confiscated. The entire family, including her very young siblings, were sent to a labor camp. She still remembers how the dirt floor, the cell the family were kept in, had fire ants. One crawled into the ear of her youngest brother. Wook Bin was punished for allegedly collaborating with the former regime. Why? Well, he worked as law enforcement. He was sent to work in the fields in a camp in a jungle. He watched a fellow prisoner catch and eat a spider out of hunger and desperation. He was completely cut off from his family and the outside world during this time. Like hundreds of thousands of other Vietnamese, after 1975, they were sent to re-education camps on the Maoist belief that hard labor and re-education can reform counter-revolutionaries into becoming good socialist citizens. Both experienced unprecedented suffering and poverty after their time in the camps. They fled along with tens of thousands of others on small boats off the southern coast of Vietnam in the late 70s. Both of them eventually met one another on a refugee camp in Indonesia. Some years later, after settling in Portland, Oregon, they had a son. And at this point, you can probably figure out that I'm talking about my parents. And the irony here is that a strain of the far left revolutionary ideology my parents risked life and limb to escape would end up confronting their son years later in their adopted home in the United States. Okay, that was a bit of a long introduction, but my family's background very much informs who I am today. Most of you in this room, if you have heard of me, I assume, have only heard of me in the past few months because of what happened in downtown Portland when I was beaten and robbed. But I'm gonna step back a little bit and tell you how I got into reporting on Antifa. It really started in 2016. At that time, I was a graduate student at Portland State University, and I served on the editorial team of the student paper. One of the beats I covered at that time was politics. And I remember in 2016, we were told by those in the media, pundits, commentators, journalists, that when Hillary Clinton inevitably wins in November, that Republicans, Trump supporters, the right wing would respond violently by taking to the streets. And I think that was summed up in a magazine cover for The Week magazine, which came out just at the end of October. So this cover ended up being pretty prescient in Portland, except it had the identity of the people wrong. In Portland, we had days of violent rioting after the election results were announced. And that was the first time that I came face to face with this movement with militants who are part of this movement called Antifa. I remember seeing people dressed head to toe in black, wearing masks, running around the city of Portland in marauding gangs, carrying melee weapons, smashing up property, and starting fires on the streets. Since 2016, there's been around 24 violent protests or riots just in the Portland area alone involving Antifa. Other US cities have been afflicted by political violence as well. Berkeley, New York, Philadelphia, and DC, among others. Similar violence has also broken out in parts of Canada. Antifa is pretty recognized because of their uniform. This is called Black Bloc. It's not just the uniform, it's also the tactics that come with it. So in addition to all dressing the same in black, they will cover their face either with some type of impromptu mask. It could be a t-shirt, it can be an actual mask or a helmet. And they do that so that some of their fellow comrades who choose to be violent or commit criminal activities can easily melt back into the crowd, and it makes it pretty much impossible for you to identify somebody. They hit you and then they run back in and everybody looks the same. And it also prevents law enforcement from apprehending suspects as well. I say that violence is a feature, not a bug of Antifa. This is just a sample of some of the weapons that were confiscated by the Portland police in one riot in June 2017. And a lot of the violence is actually quite medieval. They use weapons such as blades, chains, bike locks, bricks, you name it, hammers. But aside from all this violence, what is this group and what do they really want? First of all, Antifa is a far-left ideology and movement which brings together radical communists and anarchists. They're seeking a revolution that would result in communism, but they believe that they can do it and secure a communist society without the national borders, law enforcement, the military, or state authoritarianism that has represented other communist revolutions. They want to create communities that can operate autonomously and independently of a government. Members would, quote unquote, protect and provide for one another. It's a utopian dream or dystopian, but that hasn't stopped them from trying. You can look at places like Portland where they have a lot of sway and cultural influence, where they try to literally make Antifa no-go zones for journalists, for law enforcement, for law-abiding citizens driving on the street. They absolutely reject hierarchies, so it's not accurate to really identify them as having any one leader or leaders. And it's a misconception to think of Antifa as a single organization. They're made up of many, many groups, and a lot of them don't even have Antifa in the name. So while there are groups like Rose City Antifa or Emerald City Antifa, Portland and Seattle, there's groups like By Any Means Necessary in California, there's Smash Racism DC, which was a group that showed up at Tucker Carlson's house, there's Portland's Resistance, so on and so forth. So who is in Antifa? Well, there's no formal membership, but arrests provide one set of data for us to look at who's behind the mask at some of these mass Antifa riots. Like other extremist movements, its ideologues are mostly male and young, and while claiming to operate on a mandate of diversity, they're overwhelmingly white. Anecdotally, a disproportionate number also identify as queer, trans, and/or non-binary. So what's in the name? Antifa ostensibly means anti-fascist, right? It's all doublespeak and euphemism. Anti-fascism, when they say it, really just means that they're against capitalism and liberalism. They view fascism as a part of the evolution of a capitalist society and liberalism as a system that allows fascism to grow. Hence, that's why they particularly target symbols of the US, like flags. They view this country as a bulwark of fascism. And when they say they only participate in self-defense, what that means is offensive and premeditated violence against their ideological opponents, because opposing speech, words, and ideas in their mind is tantamount to violence and can be responded with violence. Historian Norman Davies points out that anti-fascism originated as an ideological construct of Soviet propaganda. He says it doesn't have a coherent political ideology on its own. Instead, is used to define whatever its adherents happen to oppose. You see it reflected today when Antifa supporters or ideologues spiritually say that if you're against them, you're pro-fascism. What are the origins of Antifa? Antifa models its tactics and propaganda on the Antifascistische Aktion, which was a paramilitary type group created by the German Communist Party in 1932. This paramilitary was created to violently oppose the Social Democrats as well as the Nazis. Sort of for a bit of background context at this time, the state institutions of the Weimar Republic were weak and unstable, and Antifa Action was one of the paramilitaries which proliferated in this context of political unrest and economic instability. After World War II ended, the Antifa ideology was absorbed into the state ideology and rhetoric of East Germany. For example, the Berlin Wall was called the Antifaschistische Schutzwall, or anti-fascist defense barrier. Antifa ideologues never tell you that East Germany, with the Stasi, is what an Antifa state can look like. Modern Antifa groups would emerge in the 70s. In the Anglosphere, it took particular root in the British punk scene in opposition to the growth of racist far-right skinheads. The subculture would cross over the Atlantic and forms the basis of American Antifa. So how did American Antifa seem to explode into the American conscious in just the past few years? They're all over the media now, and most people who have never heard of them before 2016 now are familiar with the name. Well, it started because the election of Trump was a huge propaganda and recruitment win for them. They've been around for a long time, for decades, but their previous recruitment tactics were really limited to tabling, zines, newspapers, and periodicals. They really failed to attract new recruits. The only people who were coming in to support them were those who were already inclined to support the radical agenda. But the hashtag resistance, which intentionally uses language of war, mainstreamed militant opposition to the right, with the help of media and cultural institutions. Around-the-clock media coverage of small, fringe, alt-right groups and figures exaggerated their influence and threat, thus creating a demand for Antifa. What do Antifa groups do? Well, one thing is that they're very good at doxing. Doxing is where you find out personal information about somebody, such as their address or where they work, their phone number, etc., and release it to the public. So they spend huge resources on reconnaissance and espionage. They're essentially a scaled down and less organized version of the Stasi. And they've been given free rein on the major social media platforms to do this. They have dedicated photographers, videographers, who document people they're suspicious of. If they choose to target a particular individual, they'll release that person's address or workplace online. They use a lot of propaganda as well. Like a gang, they have symbols and signs that they've co-opted to use in graffiti tagging around parts of a city. These two pictures were taken in Portland, but in downtown in particular, these type of symbols are quite ubiquitous. They also use stickers with their branding. And what they also really excel at is intimidation and violence, as I've said before. In my own case, they released my family's address online and have showed up to my home. They've attacked me physically on multiple occasions. And I agree with the Department of Homeland Security, who describes some of Antifa's actions as domestic terrorist violence, according to a report in Politico. Most of their organizing is done clandestinely through encrypted chat rooms on Signal or Telegram, similar to what ISIS and other terrorists use. The American version of Antifa is a bit different from its European cousins. For one, it's merged its ideology with intersectionality, and intersectionality to some is basically the underpinning ideology of the oppression Olympics, apparently. The more oppression variables you hold, the more you're able to share and see truth. So their discourses now are not so much about class solidarity, but rather over issues of race, gender, and sexual orientation. And this affects the issues they focus on. They're taking on Black Lives Matter as a cause, decolonization, abolishing border enforcement. But what makes American Antifa more powerful and dangerous? Well, in my opinion, while their violent tactics are unpalatable for most, what's happening is that their ideology is being absorbed, mainstreamed, and incorporated by more and more politicians and figures in the media. A few slides ago, I showed 2 magazine covers from the main news magazines in Germany, and you can see that they have no issue using Nazi imagery to refer to our president. And just recently, former presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke referred to the current administration, compared the current administration to the Third Reich. You can just see the talking points of politicians like AOC, for example, her line about the concentration camps on our border, which, by the way, was the same line that was used in the manifesto of an Antifa militant named Willem van Spronsen, who in July of this year firebombed the ICE facility in Tacoma, Washington. He came armed with a rifle, used Molotov cocktails to stop fires, and according to police, attempted to ignite the 500-gallon propane tank that was attached to the facility. He was killed in the process by police. So, and another thing that's been mainstreamed through Antifa ideology is the hatred of law enforcement, hatred of national sovereignty. These aren't even really controversial points to hold on the left anymore. And day in and day out, many journalists and media outlets have acted as an auxiliary brigade for Antifa, put out fluff pieces on them, defame those who dare to speak out, and brainwash the public into believing that Antifa militants are actually heroic anti-fascists. So what are some possible solutions to this issue of far-left extremism in the United States? It's actually very simple. First, just give law enforcement the tools and resources to enforce the law. Where they've been able to do that, like DC, Antifa's criminal activities have been stopped or curtailed. For an opposite example, look to Portland, where the mayor, who also doubles as our police commissioner, doesn't seem to want to upset Antifa. Empower politicians and heads of law enforcement to feel safe to speak out against Antifa and far-left violent extremism. No similar compunction exists when it comes to calling out and stopping far-right extremism, rightly so, by the way. And in my opinion, I think attempts should be made to curtail mask wearing by protesters at unpermitted rallies. What happens when you have a group of people together who are wearing masks is that they feel emboldened to do things they would not normally do if their identities were exposed. I'm going to circle back a bit to something I said in the beginning. So most of you here, I assume, have heard of me only because of the publicity around the beating and robbery that happened on the 29th of June. I'm going to relive that moment just a little bit and share again what happened. So Portland has had around 24 violent protests/riots. This day should have been just like another normal day that I cover. I had a new GoPro that I was very excited to use. There were around 400 people marching in downtown against the Proud Boys and another men's rights activist group. Together, the right-wingers were maybe around 20 people, but they had 400 come up to oppose them. Right outside of the Justice Center, which is the building that houses courtrooms, the Central Police Precinct, the Sheriff's Office, they were chanting, "No hate, no fear." And I was walking along with them, and I was trying to walk to the front so I could get a wide-angle shot of the very front of the crowd as they're walking towards me. But before I got there, and while still hearing them chant, "No hate, no fear," someone or something hit me really hard on the back of my head, and it knocked me forward. I'm a very passive person. I've never been in a fight. I wasn't even sure what had happened. I actually thought maybe somebody accidentally tripped into me. But before I had a chance to turn around and see what happened, The punches came from every direction, and all I saw was just a sea of black and fists. And they were wearing gloves that had hardened fiberglass material on it, so it was like getting hit with bricks repeatedly. The assault was caught partially on camera, and it lasted for seconds. But by the time it was over, I was dazed, I was bloodied, and I just kept thinking, where are the police? I could still see the Justice Center, but no justice, just anarchy and chaos. And as I tried to stumble away, next came this hailstorm of so-called milkshakes and eggs and other hard objects. And everybody was laughing and cheering. So after beating me, that wasn't enough. They needed to humiliate me with all of this. It's been over 4 months since the 29th of June, and no one has been arrested still. That's the unfortunate reality of where I find myself today. But my quest and pursuit for justice isn't over. And I thank you all for coming here and giving me the opportunity to speak with you and to share my story. And that's my contact info if you want to reach out to me. There's also a legal fund that's been set up. And I look forward to your questions.
This gentleman here, if you can wait for the microphone, identify yourself and keep the question brief, please.
Yeah, my name is Joel Mandelman. I'm an attorney here in Washington. Really, two-part question. Have you filed formal request with the Justice Department, the U.S. Attorney's Office, to investigate if there is a conspiracy between these gangsters and the Portland city government, the Portland police, the Portland district attorney to not prosecute? And secondly, are you aware, because we've been urging this, are you aware of any formal investigation undertaken by the Civil Rights or Criminal Division of the Justice Department or the U.S. Attorney in Portland into whether or not there is a conspiracy between these gangsters and the Portland police and the Portland district attorney and the Portland mayor?
First, I'm not aware of any federal investigations into Antifa, but I've been speaking out a lot in the months since the beating to urge for that to happen because the issues that are happening it's really too big for any local jurisdiction to deal with. These people who are involved in one chapter frequently would travel to other cities in the region to commit and support violence with their comrades. So this needs the federal authorities to step in to help investigate. As for your first question, that's not something that has been done yet. So far, my counsel and I have been wanting to give the Portland police the opportunity to actually investigate what happened and not push them in any direction that or potentially make that investigation process more difficult for them. I know these things can take a long time. It's frustrating that 4.5 months out from what happened, even with names that have been given, nothing's happened. So hopefully, if it's appropriate, maybe the next step is to formally reach out.
Gentleman in the back.
Hello, I'm Thomas Wright of Metropolitan Washington Mensa, and on behalf of my friend Joan, I'm asking the question, is there any known connection between Antifa and the DNC?
Yeah, so one of my annoyances was some on the right is they try very hard to link Antifa to the Democrats. I think what many people aren't aware of is that Antifa as a movement ideology rejects the concept of political parties. They want anarchy. So the Democrats are not their friends by any means. However, that doesn't mean they don't use the Democrats to further their agenda. And what I'm seeing in some places is that there's a reluctance for some mainstream politicians on the left to be vocally critical of Antifa. Unfortunately, I think through the media have fooled a lot of people into thinking that this movement are made up of basically folk heroes, and it could be politically costly for Democrat politicians to come out against them. More recently, I've been troubled by some things I've seen in Portland. For example, there was a violent Antifa extremist who was killed recently in Portland under mysterious circumstances, and various Antifa groups locally have been urging their comrades to delete any communications they've had with this dead man and to not cooperate with, quote, the pigs in their case. I thought it was odd that when his death was announced, the mayor, Ted Wheeler, came out and issued basically his condolences and shock over what happened. He doesn't voice that normally for law-abiding citizens who pass away. On top of that, in response to this militant's death, because it happened right outside of the Democrat headquarters in Portland, his fellow comrades chose to honor him by turning the building into a so-called memorial by vandalizing it with messages calling for police to be killed. And the local Democrats there offered support for that and said they wanted to give them a space to mourn. Now, if, let's say, the situation was reversed, right? A known right-wing extremist was killed coincidentally in front of a Republican headquarters, and the response by those in the Republican Party is to allow that to happen and to have violent extremist messages up and plastered for everyone to see for days and days. Like, I think there would be an outcry. So I'm troubled by the developments we're seeing.
This gentleman here, and then we'll go to the front, and then we'll go to the left.
My name is BJ Dobsky. I'm a professor from Assumption College. Our moderator's introduction stressed one of the defining elements of the blood-soaked revolutions of the left, and that is that they have their roots in and are frequently justified by academics, public intellectuals, and philosophers. In your investigation of Antifa, how do they draw inspiration from particular intellectuals, or how much might one attribute their lawlessness to what's going on within the American Academy?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about because Antifa, the Black Bloc militants, some of them will embed themselves in student-organized protests. And this is part of the larger phenomenon of not as radical leftists who are organizing some protests, but there's this extremist element who comes in and there's no effort to expunge that or push that out. As far as for like ideologues or thinkers that they look to, there's a lot of literature that they have. They have it in their zines and their publication leaflets, booklets that they give out or provide for or sell for very cheap at anarchist either bookstores or events and fairs. And a lot of that is more theoretical. Some of the literature is also very extreme. I would call out, I would say promotes terroristic actions. The connection to that in universities is that I see Antifa militantism as the natural consequence on the same ideological conveyor belt of all of this. I think it's basically, in my view, the armed wing of those who want to enforce political correctness.
Hello, my name is Doug Blair. I'm an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm actually from Portland as well. So my question is, there have been some cracks in support for Antifa. There was an interview that Ted Wheeler gave recently, a couple months ago, where he said, if you guys stopped coming and protesting, the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer would stop coming too. And Chief Outlaw has been very vocal, obviously, about that she really doesn't like these protesters and that they're causing a problem. Are we approaching a critical mass where even the sort of people who would support these organizations are now getting kind of fed up with the violence and the destruction of property that accompanies these protests?
It's been my experience that Antifa militants really, it's very important that they control the narrative. That's why they vet media who they will allow to be near them or by them, and those that they are suspicious of or dislike, they will harass or assault. And I don't know if I can attribute this to me, but it does seem like in the past 4 months or so that the narrative chokehold on Antifa being just anti-fascists who are opposing the far right, that is showing signs of cracking. One of the things I saw that surprised me actually is that, so the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, a year ago had tweeted out a photo of himself holding the Antifa Handbook, which is written by an Antifa ideologue, an academic named Mark Bray, and he wrote something along the lines of, "This book strikes fear into the heart of Donald Trump." And he kept that up for a year until the day after my beating and assault, and he deleted it. That shows me something's happening. And since then, other politicians may be recognizing that even if they're not going to be overtly critical of Antifa, they're going to keep them at an arm's length. So it's really critical that journalists, independent journalists, and mainstream media continue to treat Antifa with the same way that they would investigate far-right extremism. I think one of the red herrings that's thrown out is that people will say, well, Antifa hasn't killed anybody, and they'll use that as sort of a way to make excuses for them. And one metric of measuring violent extremism is to see how deadly it is, which the far right is very deadly. But that's not the only metric. You can do a lot of damage to individuals, to property, to institutions without killing a single person. I included the photos of the weapons that were confiscated because you'll notice that in that there weren't any firearms, no rifles, etc. The weapons are used not to kill, but to maim and to injure. And so that, just because there hasn't been a death doesn't mean that you ignore it, right? And now, I'm also not sure if we can even say that there's been no deaths affiliated to Antifa. I think the fact that Willem van Spronsen was killed in the process of his attack, I think counts as an Antifa-related death. The Dayton, Ohio shooter, Connor Betts, who killed 9 people, didn't leave behind a manifesto as El Paso shooter did, but what we do know of his views is his long and extensive social media posts, which includes support for Antifa. According to some reports, he was part of Black Bloc, at least at one event. So he was a strong Antifa ideologue. It remains to be seen if that had anything to do with motivating his mass shooting. But yeah, we're at a point now where the narrative on them is shifting, and they're also becoming deadlier, in my opinion.
James Stockdale, Pacific Northwest native. You alluded to both Vietnam and Germany, where anti-fascist action undertook the typical communist route of discredit the state, disempower the state, and become the state. And in your coverage of the tepid response at best to the vandalization of Portland Democrats' office, it appears that it works. How do you think we as the right can be working to sever Antifa from institutional enablement?
Well, I mean, the messaging from the right has been pretty clear and unanimously condemning him. I think what has to happen is that it's about introspection that needs to happen on the left. Like, are we willing to embrace violent extremists who happen to have some overlapping goals, or we may have similar ideological enemies? To me, I think the next step is really placed on on mainstream Democrats. After what happened to me, the first politician to speak out as a Democrats was Andrew Yang, and he unequivocally condemned what happened to me. I greatly appreciated that. Next was Eric Swalwell, who condemned it, but also made sure that he let it be known that he disagreed with me, which I still respect a lot. The others weren't willing to do it, so when Joe Biden was questioned by the New York Post, his office did give a statement that condemns political violence, but the others were silenced. So I'm not sure what more the right can really do. I think what it's been doing is good, but the other thing is it's dangerous to turn opposition to Antifa into just like a partisan tool, because it's extremism that like rises above partisan politics. And the right, I think, when it's had its issues with extremists trying to embed itself within mainstream politics, those who took the steps to censure and to distance themselves, like, that was right. When it comes now, it's time for those on the left to do that. I think we need to hold accountable the rhetoric of politicians like AOC and Ilhan Omar, who keep so casually using language that alludes to the Holocaust. I think, yeah.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for being here today. I'm from Canada, and the issue there, the Black Bloc have, for the last decade, run rampant, the G20 meetings, the G7s. Why haven't federal authorities called them a terrorist organization and tried to at least not let them publicly, wear balaclavas and operate, the way they do?
So in the US, there's been all this grandstanding talking about declaring Antifa or X group domestic terrorists. I mean, that's it's in the end kind of meaningless, because of the free speech protections in the US allow people to affiliate with radical and extreme ideologies, unlike in Western Europe, which they can proscribe or ban certain groups, right? In the US, they don't do that. So that's why the KKK can exist. There are various neo-Nazi groups that can exist. So what needs to happen is, what makes it hard for law enforcement then is you have to look at criminal activities of individuals. And with Antifa, we don't know the individuals because it's an anonymous movement. I'm not sure about the laws in Canada, but I think, one of the solutions I offered, I think, is to look at legislation locally that would bar mask wearing at unpermitted protests. Unfortunately, groups like the ACLU and other have raised mask wearing as some type of civil rights issue, which I don't think it is, but that's their view. There needs to be a paradigm shift on how this country is going to be confronting this movement, because with 2020 and, depending on who wins that election, we could see another very big shot in the arm for Antifa. Some of the activities have slowed down a bit because it's been 3 years since 2016. But if Donald Trump is to win next year, they're going to show up just possibly even more than they did before, and they'll have another huge recruitment tool.
Austin Roos of CFAM. I'm an enormous admirer of your work.
Thank you.
It seems to happen that Antifa comes where Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer are. In your research, have Proud Boys been the instigator of any violence, or simply showing up, it causes it?
These two movements / groups are sort of mirrors of one another. Like when one shows up, the other has to show up. One wouldn't be able to recruit without the other. They both use each other for propaganda purposes. In my experience in the Portland area, what tends to happen is because Antifa and those who are sympathetic to them really outnumber what tends to happen is they are usually the ones counter-protesting a right-wing group like Patriot Prayer or Proud Boys. But in the past year or so, some of those leaders have recognized the propaganda appeal of creating footage of their members engaging in fights with Antifa Black Bloc and using that to increase their recognition and all that. So it's a problem that cuts both ways. I've been particularly focused on Antifa's violent extremism because I think that there's a blind spot on that in the media. I think every publication has numerous journalists dedicated to covering the far right, and there are some entire publications that just focus on the far right. And so, but there's very few or almost none that dedicate any resources into documenting far left extremism.
Hi, I'm Aiden Keith. I'm interning here, and thank you for coming out. And I guess from your brain injury, how long did it take to recover from it? I know it was difficult to see you on Tucker Carlson afterwards because you could tell how the brain injury was affecting you. So I'm glad that you are better now. And also, do you think that Antifa in the U.S. has a stronger presence here, or like in Europe, it has, I guess, a stronger presence because it is international at this point?
Thank you for your question. I'm doing a lot better. I was released after 30 hours in the hospital, and I had issues with speaking for a while, as you can see in some of those early interviews. There's been like a really vicious lie started on social media by Antifa sympathizers or supporters that I had faked my injuries for money. This was even brought up to me by a reporter with BuzzFeed, and like he asked for my medical documentation, which I ended up providing, and he referenced in his reporting for BuzzFeed, which certainly wasn't sympathetic to me. So 4.5 months out now, some of the issues I still have are really related to memory, but I've had pretty intensive speech, cognitive, physical, and occupational therapy to help me in my healing. Your second question, the Antifa in Europe they seem to be more disciplined, in my opinion, because they are recognized there and treated as a fringe extremist movement. They've existed in a form really since the 70s, whereas in the US, it's like they just recently in 2016 had a huge uptick in numbers because of the election, and because they operate from cell to cell or chapter to chapter autonomously and independently, there's little discipline or control. Like one individual can go rogue and do some type of activity that others may disapprove of, but there's no mechanisms in place to really rein people in. So I think that's what makes the American Antifa a bit more dangerous, the fact that they're really unpredictable, and the US doesn't have the experience to deal with a movement like that. Additionally, even though they won't win in their goal of revolution, I think what they will win, as we're seeing, is mainstreaming aspects of their ideology into the mainstream left.
This gentleman, and then me to the left.
Hi, Andy. My name is Luke O'Brien. I cover political extremism for HuffPost. And I have to push back on at least one thing you've said here. I don't want anyone to interpret this as an endorsement of what happened to you. I absolutely think that you should not have been assaulted, and nobody should be. But you referred to many journalists acting as an auxiliary brigade for Antifa. And I'm probably one of the people that you're referring to, which is ironic because my family members volunteered to fight communism in Vietnam. But I'll leave that aside. I wanted to ask you about Owen Lenahan, aka Prog Dad. And for those who don't know, this is a racist troll who published disinformation in May about many journalists on my beat. accusing us of being Antifa ourselves, colluding with Antifa, doing exactly what you said, being an auxiliary brigade for Antifa. Lenahan did not have any evidence for these allegations because they were not true. They were lies. But they were published widely in a far-right network. You helped amplify them. You were one of the key nodes to help amplify these lies. And the result was that myself and many of my colleagues were subjected to harassment and threats. And several people on my beat were named in a neo-Nazi kill list that was published by a fan of Atomwaffen Division. This is a neo-Nazi domestic terrorist organization that has killed multiple people in the United States. And I have since authenticated private group chats from Owen Lenahan. He was in a private group of, and I have no other way to define it, as a group of extremists who were talking in the most racist terms about different people, just horrible anti-Semitism. They were talking about how to radicalize others. They were selecting targets for harassment. Lenahan himself used all kinds of inflammatory language and expressed very racist ideas. I do have a question. I do have a question.
Okay, Mr. O'Brien, I'm going to push back on several points that you made. First of all,
Can I ask my question?
I let you give a speech.
Well, I would let you talk about Owen Lenahan if you want, and I'm sorry about the wind-up. But the question,
Okay, please let him pose his
the question is, I've authenticated these texts, these DMs, these private chats, Owen Lenahan in private chats, acting like an extremist himself. And this is a man that you promoted and amplified. And my question is, why would you do that?
Okay, I have not seen these chats that you say you authenticated. You can email them to me and also detail your methodology for how you authenticated it. I know Dr. Lenahan. I think he's done great research. I was not the one who wrote the piece that you're referring to that was published in Quillette, which looked at the connections that various journalists have to Antifa accounts, and then looked at how all the pieces that they have written have been favorable in covering for Antifa's violent extremism. And even though I was not the one to write that, I was with Quillette at the time it was published, and I think it's a great piece. I think people should read it. It's a matter of public interest for people to know about the biases that journalists have in supporting certain violent extremist individuals and groups. To your point about the Atomwaffen, I had never heard of this group until the accusation was hurled at me and is used to justify violence against me. People blaming me for providing a kill list for a terrorist organization. First of all, that's false, defamatory, I know, but I'm going to address the points and views that you have amplified on your social media. I had absolutely nothing to do with that video. I actually saw it recently. I don't view it in the same way that it was described by other left-wing journalists, but nonetheless, I do find it's troubling and absolutely reject its content, reject all political violence, and those who are responsible for that video should be investigated and held accountable if they violated laws, okay? Your particular question about No, I don't disavow it. I think it's a great piece. I think people should read it on Quillette.
Amy, you get to ask the last question. Oh, okay. I couldn't see him, so.
Hi, Andy. I'm an employee here at Heritage.
And one more thing I might add, I think all this consternation from the people who are named there and their friends comes because the piece hits a bit too close to home in its accuracy.
Because they're going out of business. Okay, Holly, please.
Andy, thank you for your story and the courage to come in here and tell everybody what happened to you and the history of Antifa. I agree with your prescription about how to solve the problem, and I want to ask you a question as a former prosecutor. It doesn't seem like this is a hard case to prove to me. I mean, as a former federal and state prosecutor, I look at those pictures there. You say it took place in front of the so-called Justice Center, which no doubt, given the bombings that happened in Portland and elsewhere, they have a lot of cameras. Your camera was running, other cameras were running. We have AI and facial recognition and other recognition technology that you can use to identify even specific types of helmets or bandanas. And it seems like there must be a lack of political will simply to figure out who these people are and just prosecute them. And so if you could speak to what you believe, because I know you touched on it, what you believe is stopping the local authorities from going after the people. These are, I mean, we nail all sorts of people, mob people, other people. And what, if any, outreach has there been through your attorney to preserve the tapes that no doubt are on city light poles or buildings, et cetera, so that someday they can go forward with this case? Because the case is going to get worse over time, not better.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I am able to comment on what my counsel has done so far at the city, but I will say that even though my case probably received the most publicity in Portland in terms of the assault victim of Antifa, there's been numerous other individuals who never received justice, and they're just private citizens who don't have the following or platforms that I do, and they have to continue to suffer in silence, which is terrible. One little bit of good news, though, is that just last week, a Antifa militant who brutally assaulted another man on the same day I was attacked with a metal baton, struck him on the head. The victim required 25 staples to close the injuries, the gashes that were opened on his head. One of the individuals responsible for that was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison. And as far as I know, he is the only the second individual across the whole United States of a known Antifa militant who's actually faced prison time. The first one was last month in New York City, actually. And so he got 18 months in that case. So with all the instances of violence that you've seen captured on video, there's only been 2 people who are going to jail.
Andy, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.